Another in a series, there it goes, of our monthly program meeting sponsored by the Woods, that's my clock. The Woods and Wetlands group of the Illinois Sierra Club. I'm Linda Tilton, and I will be your host. Our monthly program meetings feature speakers on topics relating to the environment, stewardship, wildlife and nature, public policy, and anything about outdoor activities like hiking, canoeing, bird watching. After our online meetings is completed, we'll give you more information about future programs. And just a byline, these are open to everyone. You don't have to be a Sierra Club member. Any citizens or anybody that's interested is welcome. In a minute, we're going to hear from our featured speaker, Erica Gies, who is the author of Water Always Wins, Thriving in an Age of Drought and Deluge. Considering the events that have happened in our world recently after Hurricane Ivan, the horrible flooding in Kentucky and other places in our own country, it is just so fitting that we had accidentally booked Erica for October. Her presentation will be available on our YouTube program, or our YouTube channel later, and I will be sending anyone that's registered access to that later this week. As Doug said, we are recording this so that you can watch it in the future. Turn off your camera if you don't wish to appear in the video. And again, you'll get that that address later this week. A few housekeeping ideas, terms, requests. Please make sure you are muted, especially if you have a barking dog, a clock that sings the bird sounds, as I just did, television or other commotion in the background. Be sure to mark your calendar for our last meeting this calendar month in November. More on that later. And feel free to ask any questions. You'll notice at the bottom, there is a chat box. If you will put your questions in there, we're going to sort them all out and make sure that we get everyone's question answered. And we'll ask them all at the end of Erica's program. So let's move on to our October featured speaker. Erica is the author of Water Always Wins, Thriving in an Age of Drought and Deluge, and an independent journalist who covers science and the environment from Victoria, British Columbia, and the San Francisco, California area. She's a National Geographic Explorer. Her work appears in the New York Times, Scientific American, Nature, NCIA, The Economist, Biographics, National Geographic, and other outlets, including NPR. You may have heard her. We welcome you, Erica, and hope that you feel welcomed. Please take over. It's all yours.
Okay. Thank you so much for inviting me, Linda. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to try to share my screen here. So, all right, can you see it?
Yes, it's there. Thank you.
Yes, it's there.
Okay, great. So I'm just going to tell you a bit about some of the things I learned while reporting my book. And basically, the theme of the book is about changing our relationship with water. And there are increasing examples of flooding and drought that we seem to be in the news all the time now. The terrible floods in Pakistan, Kentucky, the flooding from the hurricane in Florida, the severe drought in the US Southwest and in California. And so climate change is definitely a big part of that. I'll talk about that in a minute. But another significant part is our development choices. So the good news about that is that that is something that we can change. And so that's the primary focus of my book, which is basically a radical break from centuries of engineering-driven hard interactions with water, such as dams and levees. So, as I mentioned, climate change is water change. This audience probably knows that for every degree Celsius warming, the air is able to hold about 7% more water vapor. And so that's the reason that we're seeing both more severe droughts and rainstorms, because in dry areas, the air is evaporating more water out of the soil and plants. And in times when it dumps, it's able to hold more. So we're having these really dramatic, bigger deluges. And in fact, the water falling during storms in the United States has increased since 1958, all across the country, even in the Southwest where we think of severe drought, but they're still having bigger rainstorms. And certainly that's been true in the Midwest as well, as I'm sure you remember from the terrible 2019 floods. So these problems are affecting more and more people around the world. And I think, you know, water change is kind of the way that climate change is really beginning to be a visceral experience in people's lives, and, you know, make us realize that climate change is here. But as I said before, it's not just climate change, it's also our development choices. And in urban areas, that means urban sprawl, you know, the area of land covered by pavement. It's industrial agriculture, and it's also the very concrete engineered ways in which we control water. So the statistics are pretty shocking, the extent to which humans have interfered with the natural water cycle. We've actually filled or drained 87% of the world's wetlands since 1700. Intervened on 2/3 of the world's largest rivers. That's with dams, diversions, and river training structures, things like that. And just since 1992, the surface area covered by cities has doubled. So one big reason we see a lot of urban flooding now is because there's so much more pavement and concrete, and the water can't soak into the ground where it falls. So the reason why, you know, when we have these floods or we have these droughts in the dominant culture, in the culture of the US, European culture, you know, our tendency is to leap to kind of a single-minded solution, like, you know, we're flooding, we need to build a wall, we need a levee, we need a seawall. Or, you know, if we're short of water, we need to build a dam and, you know, create a new reservoir, or maybe desalinate some water. So it's this very single-minded problem solving that does not think about the systems in which water functions. And it's really centered on, you know, humans. We've sort of separated ourselves from nature. And therefore we put human needs first because we have moved away from understanding our role as part of the ecosystem. And so we tend to see water either as a threat or a commodity. And that also leads to this kind of single-minded problem solving. So in my book, I went around the world. I went to Peru, India, Kenya, England, various places in the US and Canada, and China, Iraq. Basically, people everywhere in the water field, engineers, ecologists, landscape architects, urban planners, are beginning to ask a different question. that gets at this kind of systems theory, which is, what does water want? And so many of our interventions with water attempt to kind of speed it up and move it off the land. And what I realized is these innovative projects that people are doing around the world all have a common theme, which I'm calling slow water. And the idea is basically they are trying to return to water some of its slow phases. So these are the wetlands, floodplains, high altitude mountain meadows and forests, where water flows and lingers on the land and then moves underground. So like I said, I'm calling this slow water. And some other things aside from like trying to restore or protect natural ecosystems that feature slow water are thinking in systems, thinking of water as an entity with its own agency. That's why my book is called Water Always Wins, because sooner or later it does. You know, we may try to control it, but increasingly we see those control measures fail. And it's not just because climate change is bringing more water than the engineers planned for, it's also because we have blocked so much of water's space to absorb into the land. But an important feature in all these projects is that, you know, you can't just stamp them out cookie cutter. They have some common aspects, but every project is unique to its own geology, hydrology, ecology, and local culture. So each project is unique. And they are also distributed. So we've gotten used to centralized water management, you know, where we pipe all the water to one location, we clean it, and then pipe it out to our houses. Same with sewage. Those things are very important for public health. I'm not suggesting that we do away with that, but there's a lot that we can do to create space for water throughout our watersheds. And you know, it's a distributed kind of idea. So small spaces for floodplain reclamation, setting back levees to make space for those floodplains, wetlands throughout the watershed. It's kind of similar to the idea of how solar panels on everyone's roof can add up to a lot of power. And, you know, some people say like, well, you know, these nature-based solutions, they're nice, but they can't be a significant part of the solution. And they can be, but we need a lot of them. When you think about that 87% of the world's wetlands that we've taken away, you understand to some extent the scale that we need to put back. But before that feels too daunting, I just want to say every little bit helps. So, you know, one kind of famous story that came out of the 2019 flood was the Nahant Marsh, which, you know, the city of Davenport, Iowa had protected. It was only about 300 acres, so not able to absorb that full flood capacity, but it did prevent some flooding in Davenport for quite a while. And the more communities on the river who will also, you know, set aside a wetland near them, you know, every little bit is absorbing more of the water and decreasing the level of the river. So there's also a community responsibility aspect to these slow water projects, some of which were really hands-on, like in India and Peru, people were actually sharing chores in the community for maintaining these systems, and then also sharing the water that came out of it. In North America, it's more likely to have kind of an educational component. So two examples I think of are in Arcata in Northern California, there's a marsh that is used for sewage treatment, and that has been turned into a public park and people can walk there and recreate. And then there's signage explaining what's happening and why this wetland is important for the water system. Similarly, in Arizona, there are a couple of different towns that are recharging water, like sewage that has primary treatment, then they recharge it into the ground and the ground cleans it further. And then that pool is a beacon for wildlife, which have been hurting because so much of the surface water is diverted. And also, again, it's a recreation area for people, and there are signs explaining to people, why this landscape is important for water. So on that theme of water and land, you may remember from school that 97% of all liquid fresh water on Earth is underground. So that sounds like potentially a good thing, like there's a bunch of water there that we could tap. But as we see in many places around the world, I'm from California, and it's definitely a problem there. People pump too much. They pump faster than nature can replenish. And the reason that this is a problem is that in some ways we've come to think of groundwater as separate water, as a source for when we don't have surface water. But in fact, they're connected through gravity and hydraulic pressure. So surface water percolates down and refills groundwater. And when aquifers are full, they can supply water from below into streams. And, in the Western United States, where we have so dramatically altered our streams, we tend to think of streams as running only in the wet season. But in fact, a lot of them used to run year round because they were fed by groundwater. But because now we've overpumped groundwater and the water table has fallen, it can't feed those wetlands and springs from below. So it's important to think about the whole water cycle and understand that surface water and groundwater are connected. And also, it's a significant way that we can store water in a much more environmentally friendly way than building a dam and creating a reservoir. So in California, aside from the overpumping, there was a long process of controlling the Sacramento and San Joaquin rivers in the Central Valley, where we grow so much of our food. And I know in the Midwest, you've had a lot of levees as well along the Mississippi and the Missouri and other rivers. And the problem with that is that the water is not able to reach its floodplain, so it's not able to soak in. So that means it's rushing away faster, which might mean that you don't have it available later in the year. At least in the West, that's a problem that we have regularly. So California is, like every place around the world, starting to experience more severe, longer droughts, and also these bigger rainstorms. Climate models actually show that California is likely to have about the same amount of water, if not a bit more. But the challenge is to try to capture these big storms when they come. And we've already dammed most rivers in the state, so we can't do that. So people are now looking into storing more water underground. And they've been experimenting with different ways to do that, like flooding farm fields when they're not being used. Of course, that's a problem to make sure that you don't, that the field is available when you get the water, and that you're not harming a crop, that you're actually in a fallow cycle. And then also, if you are fertilizing the crop, you want to make sure that you're not moving pollution into the groundwater. So it's a little tricky. So there's a geologist that I met called Graham Fogg, and he is at UC Davis. And he's been fascinated with these things called Paleo Valleys. And you can kind of see this paleo channel on the right side of this drawing. Basically, it was made by the glacial cycles. The water was flowing much more strongly. Sea levels were lower. Water kind of gouged these deep channels about a mile wide and 100 feet deep. And then later in the glacial cycle, they were filled with loose cobble, like really big stones, and then eventually buried with silt. So the cool thing about these is they're extremely porous and they're very close to the surface. So if you can find them, you can move your big stormwater on top of them, and they can soak underground really quickly and then seep into the surrounding clay much more slowly, but raising the water table across a wide area. So it's a great way to capture local water and to also kind of like rehydrate your plants from below, which can help reduce wildfires, which of course are a huge problem now as well. So anyway, the problem is, I guess most hydrologists haven't thought a lot about the underground because they didn't really understand it and they thought it was kind of unpredictable. But what Graham Fogg is saying is, like, we know that they were caused by these glacial cycles. And so we know that every river coming off of the Sierra Nevada mountains has one. And so that gives us a sense of where to look for them. And previously, people were looking for them in a very time-consuming way using well logs. So when you drill for water or oil or gas, people typically take a sample of soil, and you can kind of see the strata in there and figure out where these things are. But you have to look at 10,000 of them to find a Paleo Valley. So it's very time-consuming. Now, there's a different method being used. Sorry, I probably should click to this picture a little earlier. Anyway, it's more about the Paleo Valley and how it works. Basically, this, by refilling groundwater, it raises the water table, making surface flows stronger and healthier in the drier season, and also allows the water to remain within the reach of people's wells. So, I mean, recharging groundwater is something that's being done around the world in various ways. The Paleo Valleys are special just because they're so porous and so large and so close to the surface that you could move a lot of water underground really quickly. So now the California Department of Water Resources is using this technology called airborne electromagnetic surveys. And basically they fly with a helicopter over rural land, and they can take this kind of 3D picture, which helps them find these Paleo Valleys more quickly. And actually the red color here is the water, or, you know, the very porous areas that can transmit a lot of water, which I think is a little counterintuitive, but that's how they do it. So, you know, finding these is the first step. And then the second step is land use planning, of course. 3 have been found in the state so far, and one, which is near Sacramento, they have long had a housing development planned. It hasn't been really moving forward. They haven't built anything yet, but they're sort of like, well, you know, it's too far along for us to turn this over to water storage. So, you know, that is a challenge. But, you know, Sacramento does have a significant flooding problem. It always has. It's right by the river. So I think, you know, land use planners and city managers could potentially rethink their priorities. But it's something that local communities will be coming together across the state in the wake of the Groundwater Management Act that passed several years ago to try to plan how they're going to keep their groundwater stable. And so this is something that, like, once they know, if they know there's a Paleo Valley in their area, they could decide amongst themselves to use it for this purpose. So it's a potentially exciting development. So another story I focused on in my book is this guy, the beaver. Beavers are pretty famous as water engineers. You probably know that they build dams and slow water to create ponds and canals, more surface water for themselves, because they are good swimmers, but not super coordinated on land. And so this allows them to access a wider area while remaining safe from land predators. You know, there was a massive hunt when Europeans first came to North America that completely decimated beaver populations. And as a result, when settlers came across the country, we encountered a landscape that was already significantly devoid of beavers. So in its natural state, North America was a much, much wetter place. About 10% of it was covered with beaver wetlands. There were millions of beavers across the country and into Canada, also in Europe, although in the United Kingdom, they killed all of them about 400 years ago. And that beaver there is a different species, but it's quite similar to our North American beaver. So in North America, beavers were not made extinct, and they have been staging a comeback in recent years. And people got used to much, much drier areas, and they got used to these very straight streams that move water off the landscape quickly. And so it's sort of a shifting baseline syndrome where people don't really know what the landscape is meant to look like. So sometimes when beavers come back, people get anxious, they kill them. People are concerned about them cutting trees, which they definitely do. And they're concerned about flooding. However, there are people who are trying to use the beaver's skills to heal stream systems, which is really important because we have so dramatically sickened our streams. And, you know, one example is I go to this place in Northern California with my family. My great-grandfather built a cabin there. We've been going there my whole life. It's these high mountain meadows. And I always thought of them as kind of dry meadows, but in fact, meadows are a wetland and they should be wet. And the stream should, you know, have kind of a sinuous curve to it. Should be squishy in the meadow with the water table. But by removing all the beavers, we've changed all that. And that's another factor why we don't have streams that are running year round in the West, for example. So in the West, people are starting, well, let me skip back to England. In England, people are actually using beavers to prevent flooding, which sounds a little counterintuitive because people think of beavers as causing flooding problems. But the way that they slow water in the river means that the water is going to move downstream over a longer period of time. So if you have a big storm and you get a big flood of water, then the stream rises higher and then it floods your town, which is next to the stream. If you have a beaver dam, the water is still going to move through it, but much more slowly. And researchers there have tracked how much more slowly, and it's a significant factor, about 1/3 the rate. And so it's kind of like flattening the curve in the coronavirus pandemic. You know, by isolating, you slow the rate at which people are getting sick, and therefore the number of people that are going to the hospital at once, which was overloading the medical system. So similarly, by bringing back beavers, they brought beavers from Germany, where they had not been completely extirpated. And the beavers have been going to town, and they have already been reducing flooding in many areas. And now they are being kind of re-embraced as a way to, you know, they're ecosystem engineers. So many creatures and plants do well in their habitat, and also reducing flooding, and also, you know, an attraction for people who want to see animals in their landscape. So moving to the West, here is a little beaver with a parachute. So the idea of reintroducing beavers in the West to repair stream health goes back actually to the 1920s. California was doing it, Idaho was doing it, and then it kind of fell out of favor for a while, but in the 1990s, people in Washington state started doing it again. And now it's a widespread practice in Washington. People are starting to do it in Oregon and California. And basically, what they typically do is they relocate beavers who have come into conflict with people. in some way, and they tend to relocate them to mountains or more remote rural areas where they can slow water, and by holding it in a pond, then it moves underground. If it's at the top of your watershed, then it's going to come back into the creek over a longer period of time through the summer. It's also an important fire break. If you have beavers who you allow to build their dams along a stream or a river, you have a much wider area of water, and you also have a higher water table. And so the plants are much less dry because they're getting water from below. And there's been some interesting work in Colorado that show that these beavers' work is in fact working as fire breaks. And there have been some studies in Washington showing how much water they're storing underground. Another reason this is really important right now is because of climate change. The snowpack is becoming smaller. More precipitation is falling as rain in the winter instead of as snow. So that means it's moving down the mountain more quickly and out to sea before we need it in the summer. If it's slowed in the beaver pond, that can be a significant way to hold the water instead of, you don't have the snowpack, but you have the beaver pond, and you have the same effect of it releasing water into the dry season when you need it most. And so like all of these projects, you want a distributed network of these beavers where they're able to, one beaver has a small impact, or one beaver family, but if you have a bunch of them, they have a significant impact. There are things that can be done to solve problems that beavers are having with people. One thing is, like, if you have some trees that you really don't want them to chew, you can put chicken wire or painted sand on the trunk. There's a device called the Beaver Deceiver. So if you're concerned about flooding, you put this pipe through the beaver dam, and it allows a little more water to run out of the pond, and therefore can keep the water level a bit lower. Some people have planted a bunch of willow and alder trees along their streams, which are beavers' preferred foods. So that can be another way to keep them away from trees that are particularly special to people. But landowners in the West are finding that they are actually wanting beavers now, because they are understanding the significant role that they play in keeping water on the land. So the last example I'll talk about is this. And if you live in a city or a town, this may be a familiar sight. All around the world, people, when building cities, have tended to fill in streams with dirt and trash and pave over them, or put them in a pipe and bury them. Or if they do remain on the surface, this is a very common sight where the creek is straightened, and then there's this concrete or kind of sack channel to stop erosion. So this is the whole reason this exists was, cutting the trees that were along the stream, which made more of the water run off quickly. Then the urban pavement also not allowing the water to soak into the land causes the water to run off. Then you have high flows when it rains. And so people thought, well, we need to get rid of the water as quickly as possible. So then they straighten the channel, which speeds up the water. Then the water starts eroding the sides. So then they pave the sides. So it's this sort of arms race to the bottom in terms of harming the system. And ecologists call this urban stream syndrome. And they're marked by flash floods, unstable banks, heavy pollution, and not very much life. So I want to point your attention to what's just underneath that center arrow, where it says hyperrheic zone. So you may know what that is. If you don't, I will tell you. Hyperrheic means underflow. And basically, this is not the aquifer, but there is water under the stream bed. And it's basically like a river under the river that's moving downstream also, but orders of magnitude more slowly because it's moving through the rock and soil. On a stream, the hyporheic zone can extend out from the banks about 30 feet. And on a large river, it can extend out about a mile. So, we think of the stream as this channel, but in fact, the stream is a system and it's much wider and it's also deeper. The problem with this urban stream syndrome is that it tends to scour away the soft material at the bottom that contains the hyporheic zone until it kind of scours down to bedrock. It's another reason why you often in a city, you'll see the stream down a very, very steep embankment. It's because it's cut down over time from this kind of flash flooding. So the reason why it's a problem that the hyporheic zone is missing is because there are a lot of important biological and chemical processes that happen there, nitrogen and phosphorus cycling, as well as food creation, pollution mitigation. And so stream restoration that people have been practicing for the last couple of decades tends to remove the concrete, ideally, maybe plant some native plants, sometimes reintroduce some S-curves, put in some rocks or lumber, tree, to mimic trees that used to fall across the stream. And that the idea was to kind of make it look more natural, more like natural habitat. But people were realizing that the life that was coming back to these restored streams was not very diverse. So in Seattle, there was a stream called Thornton Creek that was flooding regularly. It was flooding a school, road, people's homes that had been built literally right over the creek. So over a period of about 20 years, the city bought out 11 homes from people that were flooding repeatedly. And they wanted to do a stream restoration to prevent flooding and also to help restore salmon because that's, they're endangered now in the Washington area. The project it was on a stream that was about 11 miles long, and the projects were two different projects that totaled only about 1,600 feet, which sounds really tiny. But an interesting factor is historical ecology, which is a practice of mapping where the streams and wetlands were in your city before things were paved over. And when you understand that, then you can understand the best places to do these types of interventions, like where to prioritize this work. And the two places that they found were actually former floodplains. So that's why they were flooding regularly. Water always wins. The water wanted to go back to its floodplain. So there's a biologist who works for the city named Catherine Lynch, and she had been reading about the hyporheic zone, and she thought, you know what? This is probably why, why these streams aren't very healthy, even after we restore them, because the hyporheic zone is scraped away. So she had a geologist come and study that, and they decided that they were going to, in addition to restoring some of the horizontal space for the stream, they were also going to restore some of the vertical space under the stream, including putting dirt and pebbles and whatnot to try to recreate that strata that the hyporheic zone existed in. And this was perhaps a first in the world project, I think a first in North America, as far as I've been able to tell. And, she had a really hard time arguing for it because, the bean counters at the city had no idea what the hyporheic zone was. And so they thought, well, this isn't important. But in fact, it was a very low cost feature. It was about $300,000 in an $11.5 million project. And there was another aspect where they were concerned that the area would not repopulate with the microbes and the tiny insects that do all this important work because the headwaters is a parking lot. So, you can't expect this diverse life to be coming from there. So they had a couple of biologists who actually collected tiny critters from a more rural stream and inoculated the creek with these critters. That was also a first of its kind experiment. And the super exciting news is it worked. So one thing about the critters in the hyperrheic zone, it's sort of like, when people get sick because their gut microbiome doesn't have enough diversity. So that's why they wanted to replenish the zone with these critters. And here are several of the scientists who did the work, who did the project, and then studied it after to make sure that it was working. So they did 3 really important studies to kind of prove that this works, both to the city of Seattle to convince them to do additional projects, and then also just to show the scientific world in general that this worked. One was a physical modeling showing that they had built these kind of structures of logs and things to try to push water down into the hyperrheic zone. And so they tracked that and they found that water was in fact going down into the hyperrheic zone and staying underground for a period of time. They did biological tracking to check out how many of the critters they had introduced survived. And then there was also a chemical tracking. They measured 1,900 different pollutants that were running off of the urban surface and flooding into the creek. These are non-point source of pollution, so almost none of them were regulated. But then they tracked how much those pollutants decreased by spending time in the hyperrheic zone. And it was really significant. I won't cite all the figures to you because it gets a little bit into number soup, but basically going through a 15-foot stretch of the hyperrheic zone reduced 78% of the chemicals by at least half. So it was really, really significant. And then kind of the ultimate marker of success, salmon actually lay their eggs in the hyperrheic zone. That's one of the important life cycles that happens there. And a couple of years after they completed this project, they actually saw Chinook salmon spawning in their hyperrheic zone. Since this project has been built, they have not experienced flooding. It's also a really significant cost savings because the urban stream, when it's really straight, it collects a lot of silt. And so cities spend a ton of money dredging that silt on a regular basis. And Seattle is dredging this area to the tune of about $1 million a year. So now they only have to dredge, I don't know, once every 3 to 5 years. So and that's because the natural shape of the stream is sort of maintaining itself over time and distributing the silt in a natural pattern. So in all these ways, people are changing the relationship with water. And, one thing I learned in talking to Indigenous people in North America and people who live close to the land in Peru and India and Kenya is the way that we tend to think about water is not innate. Many people do see water as a friend or a collaborator. They understand that it's part of a system, that it's part of life, that we need to make space for it and respect it if we're going to expect it to care for us. So, there are many additional benefits to these kinds of projects aside from preventing flooding and water scarcity. Of course, there's also habitat for many of the aquatic critters that we're pushing toward extinction, and an important carbon storage element as well, because these natural ecosystems, especially wetlands, store an outsized quantity of carbon. So you can learn more about this on my website, which is slowwater.world. And I just, we have this Infrastructure Act money and the Inflation Reduction Act money and growing concern about flooding and water scarcity. So I think we have a real opportunity right now to make different choices, to make better choices that are more flexible and that are more holistic. it can be hard to convince people from our culture that a wetland can protect as well as a levee or a wall. But in fact, it can. There are many, many studies that show this, and more all the time. So this book is an invitation to get curious about water and to hopefully explain to people you know, how this can work to make it a better world for ourselves and for other beings and for water. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Erica. And I'm going to turn over the gavel to Rosemary, who's going to take over with questions.
Okay, thank you very much. Hello, everybody. Well, we have one question wondering do you feel that communities and geographic regions are responding to the new science of slow water?
It really varies. There are increasingly people who are curious about this, but I don't think, and certainly water people understand this more and more, even people with an engineering background or people at water utilities. There's increasing acceptance of the role of green infrastructure or these kinds of restorations as an important piece of the puzzle, but I don't think the general public is very aware of it, and a lot of politicians aren't as well. You know, they are very used to responding to a disaster with, you know, an engineered solution, something very quick, something to rebuild in place. You know, you're starting to see more conversations about managed retreat, the idea of moving back and allowing space for water, acknowledging that water is going to win if we fight it. My book has a part of a chapter that looks at actually managed retreats in the Midwest, which has been an early leader. There are a bunch of smaller communities that chose to move back collectively. They wanted to keep their community together, and you know, after too many floods, they decided, you know, we're going to use our emergency money to move to the bluff nearby, you know, to see the lowland. So there are examples of that happening. It can be tricky, but I think it needs to happen more often. My hope in writing this book was to popularize this work, to bring it to more people so that it would be a bigger part of the conversation. And my hope in talking to groups like this one is, you know, you are people who already understand a lot of this and care about it. And so I feel like, you know, you are the people who can bring it to your own community and, you know, explain these things to decision makers in your area. And one thing I really like about slow water projects is they give communities agency. You know, climate change can feel so overwhelming, you know, like we're waiting for international governments to reduce emissions. But these kinds of slow water projects are things that people can band together in their own neighborhoods to do to make themselves more resilient against water extremes, and then even also mitigate climate change with the carbon storage component. Like I said, every little bit helps. So every project adds up.
Okay, well, thank you. And that's going to lead right into Jay's question, which is what can individual homeowners do if they live in an area prone to flooding? And after you answer, I do have a little information about Lake County, where Jay lives, and many of us live in Lake County, Illinois. But please, what can an individual homeowner do?
Yeah, well, certainly if you have paved surfaces, you can remove them as much as possible. And different kinds of soil have different porosity. So like Detroit is really prone to flooding because it's right along the river, it's low lying, they're getting bigger rainstorms, but their soil is also, a lot of it is clay. which doesn't absorb water quickly. It does absorb water, but not quickly. And so in a lot of places where they're making rain gardens and things like that, they're actually having to dig up some of the soil and mix it with sand to make it more porous. And in some cases, they're putting like a little kind of cistern underground. It's not an enclosed cistern. It's just a place to kind of hold water, but it has openings into the wider ground so that the water can seep into the ground over a longer period of time. For people whose soil is somewhat porous, you can build bioswales, which are basically like little rain gardens, vegetated ditches at the low points, like where you're kind of directing the water, and you can plant them with water-loving plants who are going to use some of that water and also slow it down and help it infiltrate. It's interesting. There are some cities like Detroit, for example, they actually link their taxes to the amount of non-porous area that they have on a piece of property. So,
Really?
If you have your whole yard paved, then you're going to pay more for your stormwater fee than you would if you had, more of a garden to absorb more of the water. So, I mean, that's an interesting policy that I think a lot of places could pass.
Thank you. In Lake County, we have the county government oversees the Lake County Stormwater Management Commission, which was set up in the 90s. And that's their, we have a very high water table here in Lake County. And so that's been their mission, is to mitigate flooding. And they have been trying to preserve and expand wetlands. And so there's a whole wetland policy. And there's a watershed ordinance that they have for new construction. Can you talk about that a little bit? Because they've, trying to balance good water tech rules against the needs of development and economic development. It's a narrow path that the stormwater management and the ordinance have to travel. Can you talk about that a little?
Yeah, I'm not familiar with the particular ordinance.
Right, the particular, right, but in general.
But one place you see this a lot, well, like Houston, for example, Houston was built on a prairie pothole ecosystem that once absorbed a ton of water, and now it's been paved over and it no longer absorbs water. And so there's a lot of terrible flooding in Houston. And Texas is sort of a right to develop state. And so development has been the priority. But in recent years, there have been requirements for developers to build bioswales instead of stormwater cisterns or drains, and to consolidate some of the developments to leave more of the land open, which is also an amenity for the people who live there, obviously. So I see some changes like that. I think, this problem of development in risky areas is worldwide. Like in New York, after Superstorm Sandy, there were several wetland areas that flooded. And since the storm, there have been 6 or 7 new developments in these wetlands that flooded before, because people say, oh, well, we need housing, so let's build on the wetland. And you see all of the development that's happened along Florida's Gulf Coast that left so many more people at risk from the hurricane. In California, we have it right along the ocean, where sea level rise is threatening. People really do seem to be short-sighted on this issue because, there are housing pressures. The cities want to increase their tax base, but it's really a short-term mentality, because the cities are going to be on the hook for taking care of those developments, for providing sewage and water and road access. And in some cases, if you're building on a wetland, that day of reckoning may be very soon. The other thing that's really interesting is when you build on a wetland, you're not just putting that property at risk, you're putting nearby properties at an increased risk of flooding, because you're taking more space away from water. There was a pretty interesting study put out by an economist at Resources for the Future. I have an article in Nature that's coming out in November where I interview her. And basically she tried to look at the economic impact of, if a property owner is granted to build on a wetland, what are the financial impacts on the neighbors in terms of flood risk? And it was huge. And it was up to 40 miles away. So, I think that's something that, the costs of all of these disasters are just they're going to break us financially. There's long been this narrative of like, oh, we can't afford environmental regulations, we need to grow our economy. But I hope that before we are completely crippled by these costs, people start to make smarter decisions. It's difficult though.
Wow. Well, you mentioned government. I've got one more, Linda, that crossed my mind. So the EPA was forced, or there was a change in the rule of the waters of the United States, that it had been expanded to include small streams and wetlands. And I think, am I not wrong, that it's been rescinded now to not consider some of the smaller streams under the protection of the EPA? And what's the impact of that?
It's my understanding that this case that is before the Supreme Court right now, it's called Sackett versus EPA, is actually putting this to the test.
Oh, okay.
So yeah, there was a wider interpretation under a court case about 15 years ago. It was narrowed. Obama widened it again. Trump narrowed it again. And then this case will potentially have really negative impacts if it's decided against the EPA. And I think a lot of environmentally minded people were very, very worried about it. It received a hearing last week. The arguments began, and the reporting I've read on it so far seems like people were surprised that even the very conservative justices seemed to be asking questions that indicated that they might uphold the EPA's interpretation. But I don't know when the decision is coming down for that. So it sort of hangs in the balance right now.
Thank you. And Jay, that was the same question Jay had about the court case just when I was asking it. So that's all that I have so far. Linda and Steve, do you see any other questions?
There, can you hear me? I have one question, Erica. Do you see this new way of thinking entering the textbooks, and the general knowledge? This goes against everything people have always thought. You straighten the stream and run the water off. This really needs to get in the where people are learning. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, it goes against everything that Europeans have thought and that North Americans have thought, and sort of this colonial, has been distributed around the world through international lending requirements, World Bank, et cetera. But a lot of people who live close to the land don't share these beliefs. And so, I think there are many examples around the world, some of which I talk about in my book, that counter this narrative of what we've been thinking. And my hope is that all of these disasters will have a silver lining, which is that it is starting to show people that the way we've been doing things isn't working any longer. And so hopefully people will start looking to alternatives. I do hear more people, I haven't been in school myself for a long time, so I'm not exactly sure what they're teaching, but I do hear from people who are called environmental engineers. So they're engineers, but they are studying ecosystems and understanding their impacts more. So I'm cautiously hopeful that those people are making different decisions. And I think, also with biodiversity, as we're really pushing species to the brink, this is becoming a very dire thing. And so In places like the United States, where there's a relatively strong Endangered Species Act. I say that sitting in Canada, which has an extremely weak endangered species protection. These things are required more. When a lot of these projects were built, there were not really environmental requirements, and that was a very low priority. And I think these things are moving up on the priority list. But certainly a lot of education needs to happen. And for me, I think the message is that I hope people hear is, you think a wall or a reservoir is the answer, but in fact, it's making things worse. And these natural systems, if we give them space to operate, they can do what we need them to do. So yeah, we definitely need to adjust the thinking. But I do feel like young people are more aware of these problems and are looking for solutions. So that gives me some hope.
Well, thank you very much. Perhaps we need to get your book into the hands of planners in cities and various regions, so that if they are old thinking, their eyes can be opened. So
Yeah.
Thank you so much for being with us tonight. You've certainly been delightful and given us much to think about. And I encourage everyone to get your hands on the book. It is really an interesting and good read. So we want to say that this program has been another in a series of family-oriented events about the environment and nature, and we hope that you will all join us again next month for the final program in our Sunday speaker series. I'm trying to change the name of the year. We will have Grant Spickelmeyer, Executive Director of the International Wolf Center in Minnesota, and he's hopefully going to share with us about these much maligned and underestimated apex predators. I personally am so excited that he will be coming. And also we urge you all to join Sierra Club. It's very easy, it's very inexpensive, and I think we all need to start speaking up. It's time to get off our backsides. We're not potted plants. So we thank you once again for sharing with us, and send water to you.
Thank you. If I may, I just was looking at the comments and I saw there are a couple of beaver questions. Could I say a quick thing about beavers?
Yes, please do.
Yeah, so one question was how they got out of the parachutes, which I thought was really cute. That photo wasn't actually accurate. They were in a crate. The parachute was attached to a crate, and the crate was designed to hopefully gently deconstruct upon impact, and then the beaver could just get out. And during the period when they were parachuting beavers into the Idaho back wilderness, they did about 76, I think, and only had one casualty, and that was because that guy got out of the crate in flight. So may he rest in peace. And then what can we do to help beavers? Beavers have a tendency to come to habitat that is attractive to them. So if you have a really straight stream going through your property, you can make it more kind of S-curved with various wood and rocks, et cetera. And if you plant willows, they grow really fast and can kind of recreate this riparian corridor, and they're beavers' favorite food. So they may see your land and decide that that's where they want to live.
Super. Thank you.
All right.
We do have beavers in Lake County in the Forest Preserve, and
I mean, there's a bunch of them living in Seattle. So, they will live in all kinds of places, and they're not super sensitive to human activity. So that's a good thing.
They do improve the quality of our entire world. Thank you.
Well, thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much for being with us, and enjoy the rest of this fall.
You
and
too.
we look forward to seeing everyone else in November.
Take care. Bye.
Take care. Goodbye.